Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're located on this God's green earth. Welcome to our episode on Real Talks with Amini. Today, I'm in conversation with Afghanistan's former ambassador to Colombo, Sri Lanka, Mr. Mohammad Ashraf Haidari, who has also served as deputy ambassador in New Delhi, India, as well as Afghanistan's deputy ambassador in Washington, D.C., United States. And he's also currently a senior fellow at the World in 2050 with a diplomatic career. Welcome, Ambassador Haidari. Looking forward to have a fruitful conversation with you, discussing various aspects of the situation in Afghanistan, the region, as well as the world, and the implications of those events and the relationships that are evolving right now on Afghanistan. So maybe we can start with your assessment and analysis of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. It's been more than 3 years that the Taliban are ruling over the country, and there are various reports and assessments from the ground on how they're treating the women of Afghanistan, how they're treating the people of Afghanistan, and how they're managing the governance, the economy, the security, as well as the relationship of Afghanistan with the world, and the dangers and threats that those activities pose for Afghanistan's existence, for Afghanistan's relationship with their neighbors, as well as Afghanistan's relationship with the world. What do you see and what do you hear, and what's your assessment?
First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in your show. And I also congratulate you on recently launching this show to help bring international focus to some of the worst crises, intertwined crises in Afghanistan with implications for regional stability and international peace and security. It is not only a contribution to civilization of Afghanistan, but also a contribution to regional stability and global peace. So thank you for taking this initiative, and I'm happy to participate and also support this initiative. On your question, unfortunately, Afghanistan is facing multiple intertwined crises under the Taliban, from political to economic to governance and rule of law to humanitarian. Especially the latter is very much, unfortunately, a byproduct of the preceding crises, especially political, due to a lack of international recognition of the Taliban, and as well as a lack of internal legitimacy of the Taliban. And as we know from a recent report by the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, over 90% of the Afghan people reject the misrule of the Taliban. Simply because, unfortunately, the Taliban failed to put forth an agenda that is inclusive and legitimate and acceptable to the Afghan people, to the region, and to the international community, simply because the Taliban's leaders lack A, vision, and B, independence, and of course, reliance on foreign aid and overwhelmingly influenced by external actors for a variety of geostrategic purposes that have nothing to do for the Afghan people. As a result, unfortunately, the crisis that I mentioned have only mushroomed, foremost hurting and harming the Afghan people.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just the way they're ruling the country, but also how they're ignoring the various challenges that the people are faced. For example, the climate issue, right? They don't have any attention on that. There are so many people who are displaced internally. There are so many people who are leaving the country. Millions have been forced to flee the country and are migrants in the neighboring countries and around the world. And so, how do you see that affecting the country overall?
Well, very much so, unfortunately, because of the crisis that I pointed out that remain unresolved. Unfortunately, people have no resort but to be first internally displaced, fleeing or leaving areas of origin for places inside Afghanistan for opportunities which in most cases do not exist. As a result, they have to migrate across Afghanistan's international borders, primarily in the neighborhood, with most going to Iran and Pakistan, where again, unfortunately, they are mistreated in most cases. Deported in other cases, if they still have the means, they try to make it to Turkey, and from there, hoping to make it to developed countries in search of protective and human security. And climate change, as you said, have contributed to this, and not only climate disasters, but unfortunately, as we know, Afghanistan is also a very earthquake prone. So you have seen over the past 3 years a convergence of multiple disasters, man-made, primarily unfortunately, by the Taliban in ways that we just discussed, and then natural climate, which have converged in Afghanistan, affecting what I call our nation, a nation of vulnerable groups, in most cases, women and youth and children and the elderly, while others, unfortunately, have left the country in search of an income that they could send back home to support their families. So that's why we have over 20 million Afghans needing immediate humanitarian aid, with over 6 million children severely malnourished, and others whom we don't know about simply because a lack of free press and presence of free press on the ground to really look and report on the situation of those who might be starving from hunger. And we also know that, unfortunately, the socioeconomic indicators over the past 3 years have returned to their decimal status back in the first round of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the late 1990s, where unfortunately, more people died as a result of indirect violence, which is, of course, a lack of access to, for example, healthcare clinics. That's why we have recently had reports of women dying on the way to the health clinics, which don't exist. In cases where they do exist, they are not properly staffed, and they lack female personnel who can, for example, deliver babies and support women and severe health condition. As a result, over the past 3 years, we have now seen reports of maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, and children before the age of 5 mortality rates having skyrocketed, which the legacy media, so to speak, do not report, or they're not there to report. And that's why I appreciate your initiative to bring to light these situations that the Taliban control and effectively hide from the international community, which means that more Afghans are dying today than any time before 2021 for 20 years, despite the fact that the Taliban used to daily carry out terrorist attacks, killing and maiming scores of our people across Afghanistan. But unfortunately and tragically, more people are dying today simply because of a lack of those socioeconomic facilities and also availability of technical personnel, in most cases women, most of whom have either been sidelined and present at homes, or in other cases they have left Afghanistan for the region and beyond.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, the killing has also not stopped. If you look at it, there are so many reports from around the country where, the Taliban are going around and rounding up people and killing them, just as men and women and their various names. Unfortunately, the former Afghan National Defense and Security Forces staff, former government employees, judges, prosecutors, nobody's safe, basically, in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan right now. And also, in the Western media, you would usually hear that terrorism is no longer that serious of a threat in their minds. Well, in reality, you and I see how various terrorist terrorist groups are reactivating in Afghanistan and are becoming much more of a serious threat. What do you see there? The Taliban 2.0, as they call it. What's their relationship with Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups, ISIS-K and others that are right now operating in Afghanistan and are already undermining security in Europe, and they've infiltrated people in the US and basically endangering international security?
Absolutely, I agree with that analysis. Unfortunately, Taliban 2.2 is a lot worse and more lethal and externally influenced with an agenda that has nothing to do with Afghanistan, has nothing to do with Islam, it has nothing to do with the Afghan culture. They by no means represent the Afghan people, who the Afghan people really are. Remember, the Afghan people are a mountainous people. They're an egalitarian people. They're a people that are centrifugal. They're running away from any kind of authoritarian and totalitarian rule. By nature, Afghans are democratic. A lot of people used to say that democracy has been imposed on Afghanistan from the West. That's not true. One reason that the Afghan people embraced democracy is because that's in their DNA, that's in their gene, that's their blood. That's who Afghans are, a nation of consensus and consensus building through their own mechanisms of democracy, such as the jirgas and the shuras at the very local level across Afghanistan's valleys and villages and so forth. But what has been, of course, superimposed on Afghanistan over the past 3 years is and tragic, and that's why, because they do not associate it with anything Afghan, they extrajudicially kill, target, maim, enforce disappearances, as we know, of the former members of the civilian, especially military. Those are the Afghans who defended Afghanistan against external aggression wrapped in proxy battles, and as much as, of course, now the Pakistani, especially military intelligence, criticize and complain about the Taliban, but it's also true that they still exert and maintain overwhelming influence over the Taliban, with most of them having properties, businesses, and their families, and even marriages with foreign nationals from Pakistan to the Middle East. And so that's why they don't belong to Afghanistan. They don't look anything like Afghan. And then look at the difference, for example, the Taliban and President Karzai, who's sitting in Kabul, or other, Pashtun leaders, most of whom, unfortunately, the Taliban have targeted and killed. Something that a lot of people associated the Taliban with the Pashtuns, but they do not even represent, Pashtuns or Pashtunwalis. The Taliban, who have killed an absolute majority of the Pashtuns, tribal leaders on both sides of the Doran line. And so that's why you have Pashtuns on the other side of the Doran line daily protesting and demonstrating and resisting what the Taliban have brought about in Afghanistan, in large part, of course, through support from the Pakistan's military and intelligence. So the Pashtuns have rejected the Taliban on the other side of the Doran line. It's overwhelming. We see it every day, and so have Afghans. And so the Taliban, by no means, are sustainable on their own. It's unfortunate that they're being maintained through a variety of covert support from outside, but that's short-lived simply because they have no place in Afghanistan and they completely reject it. And that's not something that you and I make. That's something what the statistics that is coming from the United Nations on the ground have reported. And so that's where Afghanistan stands, and we can now also discuss the implications of the status quo for the region and for the world, and why the world and the region should come to rationalize this status quo foremost in their own national security interests, which then also ultimately benefit Afghans.
Yeah. Before we dive into the implications for the region and the world, and then evaluate how they are responding to the situation in Afghanistan, unfortunately, not in a way that Afghans would have expected. Maybe we could evaluate the Afghan political leadership for a minute. Since the collapse and the Taliban took over, most of the political leadership have either fled the country, or some of them are under house arrest. in Afghanistan, some of them more, some of them less. Why is there no national mechanism in place whereby we could have had a government in exile, or a political representation outside the country, or some sort of a national a coalition of all the political actors who are anti-Taliban, that they could come together and challenge the Taliban's narrative, challenge the Taliban governance, and be ready and to serve as an alternative, and to work towards Afghanistan's freedom.
It's unfortunate. It's the reason why the Islamic Republic government collapsed, simply because of a lack of dedicated, committed servant leadership. That's what Afghanistan has historically lacked, and that's what Afghanistan has lacked at least over the past 3 or 4 decades. And as a result, you've had a variety of external interventions, positive, negative, in most cases negative, unfortunately, because of this vacuum left by Afghans. And that's not to say that much of our today's resistance is driven by Afghan women to their credit, and we need to applaud them. But here, Afghan men have to emulate and learn from Afghan women, and especially those who call themselves as political leaders. They're not. They've unfortunately failed, and they know that themselves. And they talk about it openly each time you interview them or others interview, and that's what they basically point finger at one another, saying, he or she is blamed, etc.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they've missed many opportunities over the past 3 years as they remain divided, as they fail to follow one or two or a number of, say, group of leaders with vision, with that servant leadership and commitment. And we are not a lack of that. I mean, we do have such a vision, such experience, such leadership potential among especially younger Afghans, people like yourself. But unfortunately, also the problem is the problem of followership. On the one hand, Afghans complain about a lack of leadership, which is true, which we just talked about. Another is also the problem of, followership. That those who have a vision, have a program of action that is realistic, consistent with the regional and global situation, and as well as resources, because resources are not there. There again, you would see that Afghans don't rally around them, don't support them, don't come on the same page or under one umbrella to move, a process of resistance and coherent resistance forward, so that the Taliban are over time convinced that we are rejected, and that rejection is quite organized and mobilized against us. And as a result, we are not sustainable. We have to, to talk to the other side, which represent the vast majority of the Afghan people. That is unfortunately not materialized, again, because of a lack of leadership from those inside, and as well as especially and those who have left Afghanistan, places in Europe and in Turkey and here in the United States, but they know, that there are clear opportunities for coming together, for learning lessons from the past 20 years before 2021, and also the past 3 years, that remaining on the sidelines, remaining divided, undermining one another, working against each other, criticizing one another, being negative, and or just doing nothing. Unfortunately, or also getting into transactional deals with external players. In most cases now, it's unfortunately intelligence operatives who just exploit those deals, towards their own goals, with giving Afghanistan nothing. So it's time for these leaders who are inside or outside, age-wise, if they're unable, or in terms of skills, they don't have it, simply, that they were ministers and whatnot in the last regime was, political, but now is a time of people who have that vision, that energy, that skills, that can work together to help, move Afghanistan forward. Then they should come around and support those people. And we're not short of them. Now we have at least 3 generations of Afghans with such capabilities, from 20s to 30s to 40s. even 60s. So together we can come together slowly but surely, build up the resistance, capitalizing on the soft resistance, especially coming from women, helping even women with resources and coordination, and working with them alongside them under their leadership to build up that resistance on the one hand, but also hard resistance. Now we have several fronts fighting in Afghanistan or intending to fight, but unfortunately, none of them talk to one another. And all of them criticize each other. Well, their very purpose is the same. The opposition collectively talking, they have one, you know, common goal, but unfortunately, they don't reach a consensus on how to reach that goal, on the leadership, on the mechanisms, on resource mobilization, and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. You rightly mentioned how the Afghan women are much more of a stronger force of advocates for Afghanistan and Afghanistan's freedom, and they have been in the past 3.5 years in various platforms, and they courageously stood, against the Taliban on the first days when the Taliban rolled into Kabul. They protested in Kabul and Herat and Mazar Sharif and different provinces. So more power to them. They're truly role models for all of us to follow. But the younger generation have also made efforts into emerging as potential leaders for the country, given the vacuum that is there due to the older generation being completely inactive or not interested in taking on the Taliban. But we see that their efforts are not leaded has not led to establishment of a national mechanism yet, but they're working on it. And one of the reason is that this older generation are still trying to be relevant while not doing much, but probably also undermining the efforts. So what do you think the younger generation could do in order to rally around charismatic individuals and leaders in order to take the matters in their own hand, basically to serve the country and take the country out of the Taliban's hands?
Sure. I think the younger generation know that the older generation, we can definitely draw on their experiences, in most cases negative, just for lessons to be learned, that they were always divided, that they were more involved in infighting as opposed to working together to help, rebuild and secure the future of Afghanistan. They had 20 years to do that with overwhelming international support. Imagine how much they could have done had they worked together to build state institutions and resource them with capable human resource. Definitely, I think the collapse would not have happened. They did not. So that's what the younger generation look at to and learn. That's a strategic lesson to their benefit. And then the older generation is phasing out. Let them phase out. If they don't step, up to the plate to do their part, they're phasing out anyway. I mean, it's biological, it's natural, age-wise. So the younger generation shouldn't wait for the older generation. Their time is past, long gone, and they fail to serve Afghanistan. So with those lessons learned, then they shouldn't repeat what the older generation unfortunately failed to do in Afghanistan. But the younger generation, especially those in their 30s and 40s, have a shared responsibility to rally around those with vision, those with that energy and commitment and loyalty to the future of Afghanistan, core national security interests of Afghanistan, and to work with the region and beyond the region on shared again interests and common concerns, and support those younger leaders. Not everyone can be a leader, but with some to be supported, the rest can follow, and followership itself is leadership. If we all have different capacities and different levels of commitment, different set of responsibilities, and those who can do a lot more should be supported by the rest. And with this in mind, learning lessons from the older generation, identifying and supporting get potential strong visionary leaders. The rest should follow, and once that happens, we can, follow or pursue a multi-pronged approach to helping resolve Afghanistan's multiple problems, from launching a political process to working with women on soft resistance, while of course working together to mobilize resources from sources that share our values and interests for hard resistance. And that's how, as a kind of multi-pronged process, over time, we can build up a meaningful, forceful resistance, one that really exerts meaningful pressure on the Taliban to bring them back to the negotiation table for a sustainable political settlement, one that culminates to the formation of a legitimate, inclusive government that is acceptable to the Afghan people, to the international community. And that is the solution to addressing the growing challenges facing our people, simply because such a government acceptable to all sides doesn't exist. And it's the shared responsibility of our young leaders, those inside, those in the region, those in Europe and here in North America, to work together to add up the voices and the strengths to help Afghanistan.
Yes, and I see very positive signs, fortunately, these days of the efforts the younger generation are doing throughout the world in working together, not in a centralized mechanism, but really in a decentralized fashion. They are coordinated. The anti-Taliban wave that has started in social media and mainstream media is really admirable. On how they've pushed back all of the Taliban activists, and how they've pushed back the Taliban sympathizers, and even some of the Western Taliban sympathizers are isolated because of this anti-Taliban wave that has started. And so it's really commendable, and hopefully soon we'll agree on a proper mechanism to exercise power and to utilize it to free the country from the Taliban. We'll discuss more about your solution, whether you're hopeful, where that hope is coming from, that there could be a negotiation, a settlement with the Taliban in a bit. But let's dive into the regional implications of the current situation and the global implications. How do you see the Taliban interacting with the countries in the region and around the world, and how these countries around the world are responding to the situation? Are you seeing their relationships that are mostly, it seems, tactical and intelligence based, and very narrow, specific issues that they tie to their national interests that we believe in the long term might be counterproductive to them? How do you see them behaving and dealing with the Taliban, and how is that being perceived by you as a representative of Afghanistan?
Unfortunately, now we're in a world where the rules-based world order is weakened for a variety of reasons, simply because most states tend to be national security states, and in many ways multi-aligned, regardless of the values that they espouse. And in that light, unfortunately, most countries in the region and beyond the region have engaged pragmatically with the Taliban, not so much on issues of values, but on national security interests. That said, most member states of the United Nations, there's a reason why they haven't recognized the Taliban, because the Taliban, as we discussed, lack that internal legitimacy and external recognition, simply because the Taliban do not abide by any kind of rules, as much as other states now have also begun violating, but it's still, they abide by certain core rules which the Taliban don't. Let's now look at human rights, for example. It's only in Afghanistan where there is an active gender apartheid enforced by this totalitarian medieval entity, which is actively violating anything Afghan culture, of course, the Afghan constitution, which is evaporated, and as well as Afghanistan's international obligations. We are party to so many treaties which over 190 other states have acceded to, and whether weakly or strongly they implement, but they do, and then unfortunately the Taliban don't. And so the states engage with the Taliban for their own, national security interests purposes, and in the neighborhood, the Taliban are looked at as a strategic trap. That's why China, as much as people talk about it here in the West, that once NATO is gone, China would step in and take over Afghanistan's minerals, has not materialized, with the exception of some investments here and there. China's not put any kind of major capital-intensive investments in the range of 10 to 20 billion dollars. That is not materialized, and of course, certainly, India has not done that. India, as we know, is just tactically engaging with the Taliban, reinforcing what is happening in Pakistan, that mostly coming from TTP harbored in Afghanistan under the Taliban, and Central Asians as well, have mostly contained the challenges that I've already spelled over, at least in case of Tajikistan, because Taliban in Afghanistan have been actively supporting the formation of the Taliban of Tajikistan. And so is the case with China, again, is all primarily concerned about the presence of ETIM, East Islamic of Turkestan, separatists and terrorists, again, harbored and sheltered in Afghanistan. So as you see, none of the neighbors or Iran as well, on either issues of water or also their collaboration with the Taliban and support of Al Qaeda and exploitation of Al Qaeda by that state actor, whether in the immediate neighborhood or in the Middle East. And so as you see, it's all transactional, all pragmatic, all geared towards their own national security interests that have nothing to do with helping stabilize Afghanistan in a win-win-win way, meaning win for the Afghan people, win for regional stability, and win for international peace and security. And that's where I think we, the opposition, and the Afghan people, over 95% of the Afghan people and the opposition should push for an agenda that is a win for everyone in the region and beyond, because the Taliban certainly present no alternative in terms of shared peace and prosperity and stability in the region and beyond. They're just being exploited simply because that's who they are. Their background, as we know, they were formed as a proxy back in the 1994, and then nurtured and trained and equipped and deployed by the Pakistani army and intelligence into Afghanistan in a long proxy battlefield to destabilize the country in search of achieving strategic depth, which they succeed in. That's why ISI chief, immediately after the fall of Kabul, visited Kabul and celebrated that victory. And Prime Minister Imran Khan, which today he is paying, unfortunately, is fighting for democracy, but he played a instrumental role alongside their military intelligence to topple a growing young democracy in their immediate neighborhood, which would have helped Pakistan today. Imagine that, Imran Khan, if he had somehow managed to oppose that role of Pakistan to topple our democracy, today Pakistan would have been in a different place, both in terms of political stability and as well as economic stability. And today Pakistan would have been in a much better state. And so I think the lesson from Pakistan, I should also highlight, is very relevant for India today, because India today is completely disregarded the Afghan people in whom India invested for decades. And that's why I wrote this op-ed in a major Indian paper, how India is unfortunately losing the trust of the Afghan people. And that's why one indication of that is that, if you recall, Mr. Amini, before 2021, there was not a single day that you wouldn't see all praises and commentaries very positive in support and in favor of India on Afghan social media, from Facebook to Twitter and so forth. What has happened to all of that? It doesn't exist. It's all gone. In any Afghan that you talk to, they say, well, I was given a visa before 2021, and that visa is canceled. Thousands of Afghan students, unfortunately, who had pursued 2 years, almost, they were about to graduate. They were not allowed to go back to, complete their studies. Why? For what reason? And then even Afghan diplomats who work alongside Indian diplomats to advance our shared values in democracy, freedom, human rights, and even, of course, all in the Afghan Hindu Strategic Partnership Agreement, for which Afghans paid with their lives and limbs for years, because the Taliban reacted and daily killed and maimed in reaction to the signing of that agreement. But all of that evaporated now. Pakistan is daily shaking hands and hugging these terrorists and extremists in violation of that agreement, and violation of the friendship of the Afghan people with the Indian peoples for decades, and in violation of international law and the UN Charter. So the lesson from Pakistan support for the Taliban, for India and the rest of the region, is that this is not a group, even a group, a militant terrorist group, that they should trust by any means. There are state actors. They should see a state actor in charge and in control of Afghanistan that abides by its own values and culture and national interests, and as well as international obligations and laws. So together, the region and such a government that's legitimate and inclusive should collaborate on issues of shared interest and concern, and help move Afghanistan forward and help stabilize Afghanistan right at the heart of Asia. If you look at Afghanistan, as we know, as much as some people say, well, Afghanistan is neglected, it's forgotten, it's not important anymore, that's not true. We're so geopolitically located that none of the countries in the region and beyond can neglect Afghanistan. They can either destabilize Afghanistan, for now benefit from that, but be harmed by such approach on the long run, as we know from 9/11 and from the 1990s, or at least on Afghanistan, they reach a consensus, and there's a consensus. That's why, the P5, the members of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, that one thing that they have consensus on is on the situation in Afghanistan. That's why none of them have recognized so far, and that's why they all complain, criticize, are concerned about the growing threats of terrorism, extremism, criminality, human trafficking, drug trafficking, all those things, because they're spilling across international borders, damaging, undermining public health, contributing to these terrorist sleeper cells across Europe. We saw terrorist attacks traced to Afghanistan in Europe. We saw potential terrorist threats here in the U.S. traced to Afghanistan, the arresting of that unfortunately brainwashed Afghan who turned out to be a Daesh associate, and Oklahoma, and as well as with FBI being very concerned and on the watch on the presence of those threats, and even that shooter who attempted an assassination on the life of incoming President-elect Donald Trump. So the consensus there destabilized Afghanistan in the hands of non-state actors available for rent by anyone, be it state actor, non-state actor with different ideological and geostrategic goals, helps no one. And that's why we, the Afghan people, expect, especially Afghan women, as their message, encourage international state actors under the United Nations charters, the Secretariat himself, especially the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, to really pay tangible attention to Afghanistan, not just mention it here and there and deliver remarks here and there, but pursue an intra-Afghan dialogue and create a contact group, which I think it has happened in case of many countries where it has not been peace and protracted conflict, that the sector itself, even without much support from the Security Council and the General Assembly, can initiate to have a group of countries, friends of Afghanistan, partners of Afghanistan, with goodwill for Afghanistan. For example, Japan can be on board to help bring about this intra-Afghan dialogue for formation of a legitimate, inclusive government with regional buy-in and support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, the neighboring countries have not done a good job, of course, along with others, in dealing with the Taliban. We saw how the Chinese foreign minister was the first who traveled to Afghanistan on the first days of the Taliban takeover, and probably they shaped the cabinet of the Taliban, and that could be attributed to the isolation of some of the people who have been engaging with the West. It could be attributed to them, and I hear right now that these days a delegation from China and Russia are right now in Kandahar and Kabul and back and forth, and they're trying to, I don't know, trying to formalize their back behind the door, closed door deals that they have together. Unfortunately, they're trying to utilize and see if the Taliban as a terrorist umbrella group could be utilized to in their fight with the West. So we'll see how with that shape. So coming back to Afghanistan issues, you talked about repeatedly mentioned intra-Afghan negotiation and dialogue, and there's a sense among our community that probably that it has never worked with the Taliban. In the first time they came take over power, they never negotiated with the Islamic State at the time. They didn't negotiate with the resistance at the time. They didn't negotiate with the first elected president, with the second elected president, and they even utilized negotiation as a tactic with the U.S. and coalition forces to only force the withdrawal, complete withdrawal. They didn't have negotiation as a mechanism to resolve challenges, and they have had an opportunity in the past 3.5 years to speak with Afghans and to negotiate and to find the path forward. So tell us why you think that we should still be hopeful on that front, and also how do you see other approaches that people are presenting, whether that is an armed resistance or fighting against the Taliban, or another mechanism that is recently being debated among the socio-political elites in Afghanistan, that is a possibility of a national uprising, a people's uprising, that if that could be implemented, the Afghan could take the lead and do it, and then the US and the Western countries and then regional countries could support the people of Afghanistan taking the matters in their own hand and toppling the Taliban regime and then forming a people's government. But also there's some rumors that maybe there could be a coup d'etat between the Taliban. So tell us, what do you think could be probably a solution out of the current crisis?
I think the best and win-win solution for all sides, including the Taliban, is for the Taliban to realize the potential of the resistance that's there, and realizing that they should just come around among themselves foremost, agree to resume participating in an intra-Afghan dialogue. And there are already initiatives, be from the Vienna process and the moderation movement and others with different goals, but more or less, if the Taliban really Afghanize this and without much external support among themselves, realizing that the past 3 years have proven that they remain illegitimate, they remain unrecognized, and as a result isolated, and also that they lack the know-how from governing effectively to international relations and diplomacy to really run a modern, functional, effective government, one that works at home and regionally and globally to help ensure sustainable peace and development in Afghanistan. They're not equipped to do it. They know it, right? If they realize this and then resume this dialogue, and then other Afghans also want that, that they want an inclusive government. Of course, on who should be included this time around, looking at everyone's record, which we discussed, that an inclusive government doesn't mean that the same elements should be included. Same failed elements. Now there are younger generations who we've pointed out with the capacity, with the vision, with the energy, with, of course, the capacity to negotiate, the capacity to compromise. If the Taliban unfortunately failed to do so, then of course, alternatively, the opposition could and should come together, could and should mobilize and organize in much more effective and impactful ways that they have unfortunately so far failed on the one hand, but they should also at the same time work to enlist the support of um, external players, because without an external sponsor, it is almost impossible, because we need the resources on the short run. We need the diplomatic support on the short run, and then in the long run, we need the diplomatic and guarantees, and as well as also peace enforcement support. Because if the Taliban refuse to participate, then it becomes a peace enforcement mission, which means that we need to have a multinational force to be deployed to Afghanistan to help the resistance and their approach to somehow force the Taliban out, which is a scenario that most international state actors are not interested in. As a result, the best scenario is one that I think Afghans to the position, unite and then work with, credible external players, and also define the outcome of what they're pursuing, and those state actors, external stakeholders, national security interests. Because at the end of the day, those stakeholders, as we have seen over the past 3 years, ask what is it, and this for us to re-engage in Afghanistan. We did once for 20 years. Unfortunately, for different reasons and factors, we failed. And this time around, we just stayed at distance and engaged pragmatically on issues that serve our self-interest. And as a result, it is again comes back to the Afghan opposition to really define, first of all, to demonstrate that um, um, uh, that unity at a degree that is acceptable in terms of coming together, and also convincing external players to invest and their peace efforts on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, to define for them that the outcome would be to their national, to the advantage of or interest of their nation. So that's how I see this. I think moving forward, and I think those in Afghanistan that are in touch with the Taliban or used to, lead the government, people like President Karzai should have such dialogues with the Taliban to really draw their attention, especially those constructive leaders of the Taliban, the younger, Taliban, how we've been socialized enough for the past 30 years. Yeah, that they fought for a long time, but also it's not that they were in complete isolation. Those in Pakistan and have extensively traveled there and the region, and of course have been running an office in Doha. They've been exposed. They see how the world is operating. It's not operating based on the, the decrees and edicts of the medieval era and the seventh century, even worse than that. That they have to look at Islam. They have to, study Islam and both the Quran and the Sunnahs of the Prophet Muhammad, and look up to his leadership, learn from his pragmatism and visionary leadership, and his protection in support of women. Remember that Islam, one reason that came into being was to help save the female infanticide from being buried in ancient Arabia. So what the Taliban are doing is completely anti-Islamic. what they're doing is actively contributing to Islamophobia, and something that the Afghan opposition should draw the attention of the OIC countries, the Middle Eastern countries, the Muslim world, to, and ask them for support to help rationalize the status quo in Afghanistan, because no matter what reforms the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is undertaking to, of course, in their national interest, but on a global level, given that they're the custodian of the two holy sites, and they have an obligation to help fight Islamophobia effectively. And one area that they could, at least from that perspective, from that angle, could help address this global challenges to help rationalize the status quo in Afghanistan, consistent with their own reforms at home, where they're liberating women, where they're putting women in charge across the government, across the society, and increasingly even in diplomatic positions. Saudi Arabia today is one of the most capable, ambassadors here in Washington, actively speaking. So is the case with Qataris, so is the case with the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf states, most of which befriended the Taliban. That's why they've provided the Taliban with all sorts of resources, and even to some extent enabled them to gain some legitimacy by allowing them to open a political office, for example, in Doha. And so the Afghan opposition, at the end of the day, have all these opportunities if the Taliban don't do their part. Coming together, the Afghan opposition, with those inside doing their part with the Taliban, with others outside coming together on issues that we just discussed. It takes time. It's not easy. It needs resources, but we know we have the know-how, we have the energy, we have the commitment. It just takes the leadership and the followership, which we discussed, to come together, and then working on this process until Afghanistan is liberated, or until the Taliban comes around and joins the process and become a part of a government that represents all Afghan views, all Afghan faces, all Afghan ethnicities, sects, and including the Jewish and the Hindus and the Sikhs.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a big wish. It's a big dream to have in order to be positive for the Taliban to be that. I'm more of an inclination that it's liberty, it's freedom. We need to get rid of all of these terrorist groups, Taliban, ISIS, Al Qaeda, whoever they are, IRGC, others. I mean, humanity cannot survive and cannot live in peaceful coexistence as long as there are extremist groups around who are resorting and using violence to impose their ideology upon a collection or collective of human beings, and particularly any group that is their agenda is imprisonment of more than half of human race. I mean, we shouldn't allow them to breed, let alone have political offices or have a state control. I mean, they should be locked up in jails around the world, and hopefully we will get there at some point. So, I mean, great conversation with you, Ambassador Haidari. I learned a lot. It was very comprehensive. You mentioned you had messages in your discussions to Indian officials, to the neighboring countries, to the Islamic countries, of course. If the Islamic countries had the unity of purpose with respect to Afghanistan, Afghanistan would not have been in this situation. I mean, that shared identity of being Muslims, they talk about it when it comes to serving their interest, but they don't talk about it when it comes to Afghanistan. It's the Afghan people or Afghan women, they don't consider them as Muslims when it comes to their dealing with the Taliban. I mean, would they allow a Taliban group to operate in their countries? Would they allow such a group to take power in their countries? I mean, the hypocrisy is very much obvious there. But what's your message to the liberal countries of the world, to the Western world, to Europe, the United States? What's your recommendation for them to do in order to have to stand on the side of the Afghan people and our shared interest, which is a free world from terrorism? I mean, for more than 20 years, Afghans were in the front line of defending the world in the battle against terrorism. And that's why there wasn't much terrorist attacks in the West. And I think that has made some people complacent, thinking that maybe they have done the job. But the threat is still there. We know it's much more serious. And so now, right now, if the Afghans are not fighting against it and nobody else is paying attention, this over-horizon capabilities is not enough. And we see how it has undermined the security in Europe and in the United States. It's growing a threat. So they need to come back and work with their counterterrorism allies and to be on the same page on how they're gonna manage this quagmire that has been created right now. A state where a terrorist group is in charge, there's no flag, there's no constitution, there's no rule of law, there's no diplomatic representation, there's no accountability, and they're only tactically engaging, all of them on small issues that sometimes counterproductive to their interest and to their alliance, and the terrorists are basically benefiting from all of that. What do you tell their leadership, and what do you tell their people?
I think we discussed most of these, and really, I think my message on behalf of the Afghan people is really one of moral, and it both for the West and the rising powers of the East. Unfortunately, Afghanistan has long been a protracted conflict of geopolitics, to which countries in the region, countries in the Middle East, and countries in the West have contributed since 1979. So I remind them, this is a people who've been suffering because of this protracted conflict of geopolitics to which you have contributed in one way or another. We're thankful to those who contributed positively for some time, but also unthankful to those who have contributed negatively, unfortunately. The message is one of moral, as I said, that they're morally obligated to at least discontinue geopolitical great power competition, at least in the Afghan case, and gave this people, this suffering nation, long suffering nation, a break after over 45 years of suffering, war, destruction, many waves of displacement. We have 11 million Afghans on the move as we speak because of what unfortunately has been brought about in Afghanistan. I also criticize, of course, Afghans, not short of that, but it is an opportunity, and the stakeholders in the region, from China to India to Russia to Iran to Pakistan. These are some of the principal stakeholders now, all in SCO, and all under the SCO's agenda concerned about growing threats of terrorism, extremism, criminality, and separatism, all now emanating from us. On the other side, the West being grossly, unfortunately, or strongly concerned about a lack of, human rights and violations in human rights and gender apartheid, and name it, and as well as, again, growing threats of terrorism and extremism emanating from Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. So here, if they just set aside the geopolitical tensions, interstate tensions, and rivalries aside, and build at least in the verbal consensus that exists among them, and really help translate that verbal consensus into tangible, concrete actions for achieving sustainable peace and prosperity in Afghanistan, right at the heart of Asia. I think benefiting those in the region and benefiting the West through a variety of ways, because ultimately Afghans demand the institutionalization of freedom and democracy and peace, which would, of course, benefit them ideologically, which would also provide, peace and stability to ensure, the free and easy flow and operation of all the supply chains that fuel the global economy, including those of the West. So Afghanistan is and can be a center of international cooperation once again, where other, these competing forces confront elsewhere. Afghanistan is one place because ultimately they cannot endlessly confront one another. They do need to cooperate much during the Cold War, as the Soviet Union and the West did. There were many areas where they were, pursuing or fighting hot battles, including in Afghanistan. But there were also many places where they used to collaborate, cooperate, partner. For example, space is one, environment is another, education is yet another, and as well as trade and investment and so forth, benefiting the whole humanity, regardless of the differences geopolitically and geostrategically. And Afghanistan offers them that potential. And simply after 45 plus years of suffering and the miseries that the Afghan people have unfortunately been suffering from, and the many waves of internal displacement, external displacement, and now the extreme poverty and climate and the protractedness of the conflict. So our moral appeal is for them to give the Afghan people in Afghanistan a break, come together and help stabilize. And if they want, this can be achieved probably in less than a year with the Taliban, disarmed, de-radicalized, and included. If they're de-radicalized and disarmed and denied the resources, they would have no choice. What would the Taliban do? It's these external players that either directly or indirectly maintain these people, because they're not wanted by the Afghan people. They're not even wanted by the peoples of the region and beyond the region, because they do not represent humanity in the 21st century under any values and interests. That's why they're so peculiar, strange, and something unacceptable by any means. It's just a group that came into being for a strategic purpose. It's a group that can be dissolved accordingly, provided that these different competing players come together and carry out their moral obligations, their own values, their own cultures, and under international laws under which they have obligations and responsibilities. That's what the Afghan people want them to act differently from more of the same after 45 plus years of death and destruction in this beautiful land.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Haidari. That was a great message. I hope those who are watching, particularly the policymakers in the region around the world, listen to Ambassador Haidari's message for the sake of greater and common good. So I'm sure there's a lot that we could discuss, but we'll end it today here. Of course, we'll have you again on our show and discuss various aspects much more in detail. This was an overview. So thank you very much for your time and giving us an opportunity to speak with you. And to all of the those who are watching, thank you very much. This was our talk today, the episode on Real Talks with Amini. Until we meet again for a new episode on our show. God bless you, God bless Afghanistan, and God bless our world.